At my sister's lavish country club wedding, my father pulled me aside during the reception. "Listen carefully, Marcus," he said, his breath heavy with expensive scotch. "We've invested everything in Stephanie's future. Your college dreams? That ship has sailed. Time to be realistic about your place in this family." I nodded slowly, swirling the champagne in my crystal glass champagne that costs more per bottle than my monthly community college tuition. Then I smiled and said 4 words. That drained the color from his face. "Check your phone, Dad." "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The chaos that erupted 30 seconds later would reshape our family forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, not at the wedding, but in a cramped apartment in downtown Phoenix 3 years earlier. Was 19, working the night shift at Morrison's 24-hour diner, my apron stained with coffee and grease when the acceptance letter arrived. Arizona State University, full academic scholarship to their prestigious engineering program. My hands shook as I read it twice, 3 times, making sure the words were real. For years of straight A's, volunteer work at the community center, and scoring in the 99th percentile on my SATs had finally paid off. The letter was still warm in my pocket when I burst through the front door of our modest 2-bedroom apartment. "Mom, Dad, you're not going to believe this." My parents, Linda and Robert Chen, were huddled over their laptops at our small dining table, surrounded by wedding magazines and printouts of venue photos. "Honey, we're busy," Mom said, without looking up, her fingers typing rapidly on her keyboard. "Stephanie's wedding planner needs decisions on the centerpieces by tomorrow, and we're already behind schedule." "Mom, I got into ASU," I said, my voice cracking with excitement. "Full scholarship, engineering program. They want me to start in the fall." Dad finally glanced up, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "That's nice, son. Very nice. But can we discuss this later? We're dealing with a crisis here. The florist wants to charge an extra $12,000 for the orchid arrangements, and your sister is having a complete meltdown." I stood there in my grease-stained uniform, still holding the letter that represented everything I'd worked for, watching my parents obsess over flower arrangements that cost more than most people's cars. "Dad, this is important. This could change my entire life." "Of course it's important," Mom said, finally giving me her attention. "And we're proud of you, sweetie. But you have to understand Stephanie's wedding is next month. We've already committed $500,000 to this event. Every detail has to be perfect. $500,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd been splitting rent with my parents to help with household expenses, working 40 hours a week while taking classes at Phoenix Community College, saving every penny for my eventual transfer to a 4-year university. I'd never even imagined that kind of money existed in our family. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "If we have that kind of money for a wedding, why have I been working nights to pay for community college? Why did you tell me we couldn't afford a university?" Dad set down his laptop and rubbed his temples. "Marcus, you're a smart kid. You'll figure something out. You always do. But Stephanie's wedding, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. She's marrying into the Blackwood family. Do you understand what that means for our social standing? Our business connections? The Blackwoods? Phoenix's real estate dynasty." Stephanie had been dating their youngest son, Christopher, for 2 years. I'd met him exactly 3 times, and each interaction had lasted less than 5 minutes. He had the kind of effortless confidence that came from never wanting for anything, and the slightly bored expression of someone who'd never worked for what he had. "What about my once-in-a-lifetime opportunity?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "This scholarship won't wait. If I don't accept it by next week, they'll give it to someone else." Mom and Dad exchanged a look, one of those married couple. Telepathic conversations that happened in the space between seconds. "Shh, honey," Mom said gently. "You're being dramatic. Community college is perfectly fine for now. You can transfer later when we're in a better financial position." "When will that be?" I pressed. "After the wedding." "After everything settles down," Dad said vaguely. "Look, son, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. But sometimes life requires sacrifices. Stephanie's future is secured now. The Blackwood connection will benefit our entire family in the long run. I stared at them, trying to process what I was hearing. So my future gets sacrificed for Stephanie's social climbing? Don't be crude, Mom snapped, her patience finally fraying. Your sister worked very hard to build her relationship with Christopher. She's been planning this wedding since she was 12 years old. You can't expect us to jeopardize everything we've invested in her future just because you got an acceptance letter. That night, I lay on the pull-out couch in our living room, my bedroom, since Stephanie had claimed the second bedroom. When she moved back home to plan her wedding, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how my family's priorities had become so twisted. Through the thin walls, I could hear my parents arguing in hushed tones about table linens and whether to upgrade to the premium bar package the next morning. I made a decision that would change everything. I called Osu and explained my situation. To the admissions counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez listened patiently as I outlined my financial constraints and asked if there were any options for deferring the scholarship. I'm sorry, Marcus, she said. Scholarship has to be claimed within 7 days, and it's non-transferable to future years. However, there might be another option. Have you considered student loans? With your academic record, you'd qualify for several programs. Student loans. I'd been so focused on the scholarship that I'd never seriously considered borrowing money for college. What would that look like? I asked. For the engineering program, you're looking at approximately $35,000 per year for tuition, books, and living expenses. With federal loans and some private lending, it's definitely achievable. The debt would be significant. But engineering graduates from our program have an excellent job placement rate with starting salaries that make the investment worthwhile. $140,000 in debt. The number was staggering, but as I sat in my parents' apartment, listening to them debate whether to spend $3,000 on upgraded chair covers, it began to seem reasonable. I'd be betting on myself, investing in my own future instead of waiting for my parents to remember I existed. That afternoon, I filled out every loan application Mrs. Rodriguez had recommended. Federal loans, private loans, anything that would get me to ASU by the fall semester. I didn't tell my parents.
Ow.
Something had shifted in me during our conversation. The night before, realization that I couldn't count on them to prioritize my dreams. 2 weeks later, while my family obsessed over seating charts and menu selections, I received confirmation that my loan applications had been approved. I would start at Arizona State University in September, carrying more debt than most people accumulated buying a house. But finally pursuing the future I'd worked so hard to earn. I still didn't tell my parents. Let them focus on Stephanie's perfect day. I'd handle my own life from now on. The wedding preparations consumed our household like a fever. Every conversation revolved around vendor meetings, dress fittings, and elaborate plans for an event that would last 6 hours but had taken over our lives for an entire year. I became invisible in my own home, supporting character in the grand drama of Stephanie's matrimonial ambitions. 3 days before the wedding, as I was getting ready for my final shift at Morrison's Diner before starting university, Dad cornered me in the kitchen. Son, I've been thinking about our conversation, about college. Hope flickered in my chest. Maybe they'd reconsidered. Maybe they'd realized that education was just as important as social connections. I want you to know that. After the wedding, when things calm down, we'll sit down and figure out a plan for your future. Maybe a community college program in business or hospitality. Something practical that doesn't require going into massive debt. The hope died as quickly as it had sparked. I already have a plan, Dad. Good, he said, not really listening. Just remember, family comes first. Always. What we're doing for Stephanie, we do for you too, if the circumstances were right. I nodded and smiled, but inside something cold and calculating had taken root. They'd made their choice. Now I would make mine, and I'd been making it for months, in ways they never suspected. What my parents didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything. Every receipt left carelessly on the kitchen counter, every conversation about wedding, expenses that they assumed I wasn't listening to, every credit card statement that arrived in our shared mailbox. I photographed vendor contracts, saved screenshots of their email confirmations, and kept detailed notes about where every dollar was going. It started innocently enough. I was curious about the true cost of Stephanie's fairy tale, especially after being told repeatedly that college tuition was financially impossible. But as the numbers grew, 50,000 for the venue, 30,000 for catering, 15,000 for photography, my documentation became something else entirely. Evidence, the Grandview Country Club was Phoenix's most exclusive venue, where membership costs more than most people's annual salary. I'd driven past it countless times on my way to work, never imagining my family could afford to even park in their lot, let alone host an event there. Yet somehow my parents had secured the premier ballroom for an entire weekend. I learned about the true scope of their spending through careful observation. When they thought I was studying in my corner of the living room, I'd listened to their phone calls with wedding vendors. Mom's conversations with the florist revealed that the modest centerpieces she'd initially budgeted for had evolved into elaborate orchid sculptures imported from Thailand. Dad's discussions with the caterer covered upgrades from the standard dinner service to a 7-course tasting menu designed by a James Beard award-winning chef. The guest list told its own story. 350 people, including Phoenix's mayor, several city council members, prominent business owners, and what seemed like half the membership of the country club. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a social and political networking event disguised as a family celebration. During my lunch breaks at the diner, I'd research the vendors they were hiring. The wedding planner alone charged more than I'd make in 2 years of full-time work. The band was a 12-piece orchestra that typically performed at corporate galas and charity fundraisers. Even the transportation was excessive, a fleet of luxury cars to shuttle guests from their hotels to the venue, because heaven forbid the Blackwoods social circle should have to find their own parking. The dress fittings were particularly revealing. I happened to be homesick with the flu when Stephanie returned from her final appointment, and I overheard her phone conversation with her maid of honor. The alterations alone cost $8,000. She laughed. But it's worth it.
Did you see
the photos from the Blackwood Charity Gala last month? I need to look like I belong in that family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. $8,000 for alterations. Calculated quickly, that was more than my entire tuition for community college, for dress adjustments. My documentation efforts intensified when I discovered my parents' financial strategy. Late one evening, while they were finalizing seating arrangements in the kitchen, I overheard Dad on the phone with someone who was clearly a loan officer. "Yes, we understand the interest rate," he was saying. "The equity in the house should more than cover it. This is a strategic investment in our family's future." They were taking out a second mortgage in our family home for a one-day party. The next morning, I called our bank pretending to be Dad, claiming I'd lost some paperwork and needed confirmation of our recent loan application. The customer service representative was helpful, too helpful. She confirmed that my parents had borrowed $200,000 against our house, with payments that would extend 15 years into the future. I sat in my car outside the bank, staring at the notes I'd scribbled during the call. $200,000. That was just the loan. They were paying another $300,000 from savings and investments I'd never known existed. My college tuition, which they'd claimed was impossible to afford, represented less than 15% of what they were spending on a single day. That's when I started planning my response. It began with research into the vendors themselves. Most were small business owners who relied heavily on reputation and word-of-mouth referrals within Phoenix's affluent social circles. A few strategic online reviews or social media posts could significantly impact their future bookings. But I wasn't interested in destroying innocent businesses. I was interested in exposing the truth about my family's priorities. I opened a separate email account and began documenting everything systematically. Not just receipts and contracts, but context. Screenshots of my rejection letters from universities where I'd been accepted but couldn't afford to attend. Photos of my work. Schedule at the diner showing the 40-hour weeks I'd been working to pay for community college. Bank statements showing my personal savings account, where I'd managed to accumulate $3,000 over 2 years of careful budgeting. The contrast was stark and undeniable. My research into the Blackwood family revealed interesting details that I suspected my parents hadn't discovered. Christopher's previous girlfriend, according to social media posts that hadn't been completely scrubbed, had been similarly dropped when his family decided she wasn't suitable. His older brother had married into another wealthy Phoenix family. Rumors suggested the relationship was more business arrangement than love match. I also learned that Grandview Country Club had recently been investigated for discriminatory membership practices, and several prominent families had quietly distanced themselves from the venue. The optics weren't as prestigious as my parents believed. 3 weeks before the wedding, I made a discovery that changed everything. While helping Mom organize wedding-related paperwork, a task that had been delegated to me as the family's unofficial administrative assistant, I found documentation of a conversation between my parents and a financial advisor. The advisor had strongly recommended against the wedding expenditure, pointing out that it would deplete my parents' retirement savings and require them to work an additional 10 years before they could afford to retire. He'd specifically mentioned the impact on their ability to support their children's education, noting that Marcus would likely need financial assistance for college in the near future. My parents' response, as documented in email exchanges, was telling. Dad had written, "Marcus is resourceful and independent. He'll find his own way. Stephanie needs our support now to secure her position in Phoenix society. The return on this investment will benefit the entire family." Mom had added, "We can always help Marcus with college later, once Stephanie is established. First things first." I printed those emails and added them to my growing collection of evidence. They'd made a calculated decision to prioritize my sister's social aspirations over my educational future, despite having the resources to support both. This wasn't about money. It was about what they valued. My final preparation involved researching Christopher Blackwood more thoroughly. What I discovered should have been a red flag for my parents if they'd bothered to look beyond his family name and bank account. Christopher had a pattern of job hopping within his family's company, never staying in any position long enough to demonstrate competence. His social media history, which required some creative searching to access, showed a concerning pattern of dismissive comments about people he considered beneath his social status. Most troubling was a LinkedIn post he'd made 6 months earlier. It's about strategic relationship building and the importance of maintaining appropriate social boundaries. The post had been deleted, but Internet archives never forget. In it, he'd explicitly discussed using romantic relationships to advance business interests and the need to upgrade personal associations as one's status evolves. Christopher wasn't just marrying up, he was treating marriage as a business transaction, and my parents were paying $500,000 to facilitate it. As the wedding week approached, I finalized my preparations. I created a comprehensive digital presentation that told the complete story: my academic achievements, my acceptance to universities we couldn't afford, the detailed breakdown of wedding expenses, my parents' financial capacity, and the stark contrast in how they'd allocated resources between their children. I also prepared a backup plan. If my parents somehow managed to dismiss or minimize my revelation, I had copies of everything ready to share with other family members, family friends, and even some of the wedding guests who I suspected had no idea about the financial sacrifice being made for their entertainment. The morning of the wedding. As I watched my parents fuss over final details for their $500,000 spectacle, I felt strangely calm. They'd taught me an important lesson about priorities and values. Now I was going to teach them one about consequences. The truth, I'd learned, had a way of demanding its moment. And that moment was coming. The Grandview Country Club ballroom looked like something from a luxury magazine spread. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in imported Italian linens. While the orchestra tuned their instruments near the marble dance floor, 350 guests mingled in designer attire, champagne flutes reflecting the golden sunset streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Overlooking the manicured golf course, I stood near the bar in my rented tuxedo. The only wedding expense my parents had allowed me to handle myself, watching the culmination of months of obsessive planning. The evening had proceeded flawlessly so far. Stephanie looked radiant in her custom gown. Christopher played the part of devoted groom with practiced charm, and my parents basked in the approval of Phoenix's social elite Mayor Patricia Williams, had complimented Dad on the venue choice. The Blackwood family patriarch had praised Mom's attention to detail. Several prominent business owners had already approached my parents about future social collaborations. Everything was unfolding exactly as they'd envisioned. That's when Dad approached me, scotch in hand and satisfaction radiating from his face. "Marcus's son, come here. There's something we need to discuss." His voice carried the slight slur of someone who'd been celebrating with expensive liquor for several hours. He guided me to a quiet alcove behind the orchestra, where the music would mask our conversation from curious ears. "Your mother and I have been talking," he began, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "We know this year hasn't been easy for you. Watching your sister achieve her dreams while you've had to adjust your expectations." I remained silent, letting him continue. "But here's the thing you need to understand. Family is about sacrifice, about supporting each other when it matters most. What we've done for Stephanie this wedding, this connection to the Blackwood family, this elevates all of us. Your sister will have opportunities now that she never could have accessed on her own." He paused, taking another sip of his scotch, his eyes scanning the elegant reception around us. "Now, about your college situation. Community college is perfectly respectable, practical. You can learn a trade, maybe get into business management or hospitality. The service industry always needs smart, hard-working people." My jaw tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "Listen carefully, Marcus," Dad continued, his tone becoming more serious. "We've invested everything in Stephanie's future. Every dollar, every connection, every opportunity. Your college dreams, that ship has sailed. It's time to be realistic about your place in this family. Time to understand that sometimes the younger child has to find his own way." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. This was it, the moment I'd been preparing for. The confirmation that my parents viewed me as expendable, a secondary consideration in their grand social climbing strategy.
I looked directly into his eyes.
My voice steady and calm. "Check your phone, Dad." Confusion flickered across his face. "What? Your phone? Check it now."
Something in my tone must have penetrated his alcohol-induced confidence, because he fumbled for his device, squinting at the screen. His face went pale as he saw the email notification. Then another. Then several more in rapid succession. The subject line was simple: "The true cost of tonight's celebration." "What is this?" he whispered, his voice suddenly sober. "The truth?" I replied. "Something you've been avoiding for months." He opened the first email, and I watched his expression change from confusion to horror as he scrolled through the comprehensive documentation I'd compiled. Bank statements showing the second mortgage, screenshots of vendor invoices, photos of rejection letters from universities I couldn't afford to attend, a detailed breakdown of exactly how much they'd spent on a single day versus how much my education would have cost. "Marcus, what have you done?" "I've done what you taught me to do," I said quietly. "I've been resourceful and independent. I found my own way." His phone continued buzzing as more emails arrived. I'd programmed them to send in sequence, 15 minutes apart, ensuring maximum impact throughout the evening. "Who else? ... He started to ask, but his question was answered when Mom appeared at his side, her own phone clutched in her trembling hand. "Robert, I'm getting emails. Horrible emails. They have our financial information, our loan documents." She looked. Between us, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to smudge as realization dawned. "Marcus, did you... I documented everything," I confirmed. "Every receipt, every conversation, every decision you made to prioritize Stephanie's social ambitions over my educational future. And yes, I've shared it." "Shared it with who?" Dad demanded, his voice rising, despite the need for discretion. "Everyone who needed to know," I replied. "Extended family members who've been asking about my college plans, family friends who assumed you were supporting both your children equally? Some of tonight's guests who've expressed interest in how we raised? Such accomplished kids. Mom's face crumpled. The Blackwoods. Did you... Christopher's parents received a particularly detailed email about 20 minutes ago, I confirmed. Along with some interesting research about their son's previous relationships and his rather cynical views on marriage as a business transaction. The color drained from both their faces. Around us, the reception continued in blissful ignorance. But I could see the exact moment when they understood the magnitude of what was happening. "You've destroyed us, Mom," whispered. "Our reputation. Our standing in the community?" "No," I corrected gently. "You destroyed that when you decided my future was worth sacrificing for a party. I simply documented your choices." Dad's phone rang. The caller ID showed Christopher's father. Neither of my parents moved to answer it. "Marcus, please," Mom begged. "There has to be a way to fix this. To make this right." "There is," I said. "It's called honesty, something you should have tried months ago when I got that scholarship." The orchestra finished their current piece, and in the brief silence that followed, we could hear murmurs of conversation from nearby tables. Phones were being checked. Concerned whispers were beginning to ripple through the crowd. "What do you want?" Dad asked, his voice defeated. "Nothing from you," I replied. "I've already secured my future. Student loans, work-study programs, a plan. That doesn't depend on parents who view me as disposable. I start at Arizona State University in 2 weeks." Stephanie appeared at the edge of our alcove, her wedding dress rustling as she hurried toward us. Her face was flushed with panic. "Mom, Dad, what's happening?" Christopher's father just pulled him aside, and they're having some kind of urgent conversation. Christopher looks furious, and people are staring at their phones and whispering. Notice the stricken expressions on our parents' faces and turned to me. "Marcus, what did you do?" I told the truth. I said simply, about tonight's actual cost, about the opportunities I was denied so you could have your fairy tale wedding, about Christopher's real motivations for marrying into Phoenix society. Stephanie's eyes widened as she processed what I was saying. "You sabotaged my wedding?" "No," I corrected. "I exposed what this wedding really represents. The question is whether you can live with that truth." Across the ballroom, I could see Christopher engaged in an intense conversation with his parents. His father's gestures were sharp and angry, while his mother kept glancing toward our family. With undisguised disgust, Christo himself looked like a man whose carefully constructed plans were crumbling in real time. "He's going to leave me," Stephanie whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Isn't he?" "If he does," I said gently, "then I saved you from a marriage built on deception and social climbing rather than love." The next few hours unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. Christopher and his family made their excuses and left before the cake was even cut, taking several other prominent guests with them. The whispered conversations grew louder as more people received or heard about the emails detailing the evenings. True cost. Some guests left early, uncomfortable with the social awkwardness that had infected the celebration. Others stayed, but with a different energy, less admiration. More pity for a family that had clearly overextended themselves for the sake of appearance. Stephanie spent most of the evening in the bridal suite, alternating between tears and rage. Mom disappeared entirely after the main course, claiming a headache. Dad remained at the head table, mechanically going through the motions of hosting, while his carefully constructed social network dissolved around him. I stayed until the end, helping coordinate with vendors and ensuring the evening concluded without additional drama. It wasn't cruelty, it was responsibility. This was still my family, despite everything. As the last guests departed and the cleanup crew began their work, Dad approached me one final time. "Was it worth it?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Ask me in 4 years," I replied, "when I graduate. With my engineering degree, debt-free from scholarships I earned through merit rather than social connections." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're not the son I thought I raised." "No," I agreed. "I'm better than that. I'm the son you could have been proud of if you'd bothered to pay attention." 3 weeks later, I moved into my dormitory at Arizona State University. My parents helped me pack, though the conversation was stilted and formal. Stephanie had returned to our family home after Christopher officially ended their engagement, citing fundamental differences in family values. The wedding had cost them everything: their savings, their social standing, and their relationship with both their children. But it had also revealed who we all really were beneath the surface. As I settled into my new life, I realized that my parents had actually given me the greatest gift possible. They'd taught me that self-reliance and integrity were worth more than social acceptance. They'd shown me the difference between earning respect and buying it, and they'd proved that sometimes the truth is the most powerful weapon of all. I never looked back. 6 months into my first year at Arizona State University, I received an unexpected phone call from my academic advisor, Dr. Sarah Martinez. "Marcus, I have some interesting news," she said, her voice barely containing excitement. "Have you heard of the Morrison Engineering Fellowship?" I hadn't, but within minutes of our conversation, I learned that it was one of the most prestigious undergraduate research opportunities in the HCSA full-ride fellowship that included not just tuition and living expenses, but also a generous stipend for research work and guaranteed placement in graduate programs at top-tier universities. "Your professors have been discussing your work," Dr. Martinez explained. "Your grades are exceptional, but more importantly, your approach to problem-solving is exactly what the fellowship committee looks for. They want students who've overcome significant obstacles and demonstrated real-world resilience." The application required an essay about overcoming adversity. As I sat in my dorm room that evening, staring at the blank document on my laptop screen, I realized I had more material than most students could ever imagine. Wrote about working 40-hour weeks while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, about documenting financial inequality within my own family, about choosing independence over comfort, truth over family loyalty. But mostly I wrote about learning that self-worth couldn't be purchased with other people's money or sacrificed for other people's dreams. 3 weeks later, I was awarded the Morrison Fellowship. The financial relief was immediate and profound. My student loans were forgiven, my remaining tuition covered, and I received a monthly stipend that allowed me to focus entirely on my studies and research. More importantly, the fellowship connected me with a network of faculty mentors and industry professionals who saw potential in my work. Dr. James Patterson, a renowned civil engineer who specialized in sustainable urban development, became my research supervisor. Under his guidance, I began working on projects that addressed real-world infrastructure challenges in underserved communities. Exactly the kind of meaningful work I dreamed about during those long nights at Morrison's Diner. Mom returned to work full-time for the first time in 15 years, taking a position as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic. The adjustment was difficult. She'd grown accustomed to the lifestyle that Dad's successful consulting business had provided. And suddenly finding herself back in an entry-level position was both humbling and exhausting. Stephanie moved back home permanently after Christopher's family made it clear that any future reconciliation was impossible. The public nature of their separation, Christopher had essentially abandoned his bride on their wedding night, made her a social pariah among the circles she desperately wanted to join. Worse, the boutique job she'd held before the engagement had been eliminated during a company restructuring, and her reputation made finding similar work in Phoenix's fashion industry nearly impossible. I learned these details not from direct family communication, but from my Aunt Patricia, Mom's sister, who had been one of the recipients of my documentary emails. Like my parents, Aunt Patricia had been impressed by my thorough research and strategic thinking. "Your parents are too proud to admit it," she told me during a lunch meeting near campus, "but they're beginning to understand what they lost. It's not just financially, but in terms of their relationship with you." She paused, stirring her coffee. Thoughtfully, "Stephanie calls me almost daily. She's struggling with the realization that her entire identity was built around marrying into wealth rather than developing her own capabilities. She's talking about going back to school, maybe? Pursuing a degree in social work or education." This surprised me. Stephanie had always been focused on appearance and status. The idea of her choosing a helping profession seemed completely out of character. "People change when their illusions are stripped away," Aunt Patricia continued. "Sometimes it destroys them. Sometimes it reveals who they really are underneath all the pretense." 8 months after the wedding, I received a letter that I almost threw away without reading. The return address was our family home, but the handwriting was Stephanie's rather than Mom's or Dad's. Inside was a 3-page handwritten apology. That demonstrated a level of self-reflection I'd never seen from my sister. She wrote about the shame she felt realizing how completely she'd bought into the idea that her worth was determined by her husband's social status. She acknowledged the years of taking my sacrifices for granted, assuming that my academic success was somehow less valuable than her social connections. Most painfully, she admitted that she'd actively encouraged our parents to prioritize her, wedding over my education because she believed she deserved their investment more than I did. "I know you have no reason to forgive me," she wrote in her conclusion. "I know I participated in treating you like a second-class member of our own family, but I want you to know that I'm trying to become someone worth forgiving. I've enrolled in community college to finish my degree, and I'm volunteering at a homeless shelter downtown. I'm learning what it means to earn respect rather than expect it." The letter moved me more than I'd anticipated. This wasn't the superficial apology of someone trying to restore family harmony. It was the genuine recognition of someone who'd had to confront the ugliness of her own character and was working to change it. I called her that evening. Our conversation was awkward at first, but gradually became more honest than any communication we'd shared since childhood. She told me about volunteer work, about helping families navigate social services and housing assistance. She talked about the satisfaction of solving practical problems for people who genuinely needed help, rather than planning elaborate events for people who already had everything. "It's harder than I expected," she admitted, "but it's also more meaningful than anything I've ever done. I understand now why you chose engineering. There's something powerful about using your skills to build things rather than just existing in luxury." 6 months later, Stephanie was accepted into a social work program at Arizona State University. She would be starting as a sophomore, having earned enough credits at community college to transfer with advanced standing. More surprisingly, she'd applied for and received need-based financial aid, something that would have been unthinkable during her previous incarnation as a social climber. Our parents' reaction to Stephanie's career change was mixed. They were supportive of her education, but clearly disappointed that she'd chosen a field they associated with lower social status and modest financial rewards. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were applying the same prejudices to Stephanie's choices that they'd applied to mine. But now they lacked the financial resources to offer alternatives. My sophomore year brought new opportunities and recognition. My research with Dr. Patterson on sustainable housing solutions for low-income communities was selected for presentation at a national engineering conference. The work caught the attention of several major firms specializing in urban development, and I received internship offers that would provide valuable experience and substantial compensation. More importantly, the research connected me with communities and challenges that gave my education real purpose. I was no longer just studying engineering. Abstract Sci was developing solutions for families facing housing insecurity, infrastructure challenges, and environmental hazards. Every project felt meaningful in ways I'd never experienced before. During spring break of my sophomore year, I decided to visit Phoenix and see my family. It had been over a year since I'd been home. I was curious about how everyone was adjusting to their dramatically changed circumstances. The house looked smaller and shabbier than I remembered. The landscaping that Mom had once maintained meticulously was now overgrown and patchy. Dad's luxury sedan had been replaced with a practical used car. These weren't just cosmetic changes, they were visible evidence of a family that had learned to live within their actual means rather than their aspirations. Mom cried when she saw me. It's not from sadness, but from something that looked like relief mixed with pride. "You look good," she said, studying my face as if memorizing it. "Confidence, happy, like you know exactly who you are." Dad was more reserved, but there was something different in his demeanor. The desperate ambition that had driven his social climbing seemed to have been replaced by a quieter, more genuine contentment. "How's school?" he asked. And for the first time in my memory, The question felt like genuine interest rather than polite obligation. I told them about my research, my fellowship, my plans for graduate school, and eventual career in sustainable engineering. I watched their faces as I described projects that would help communities rather than enrich developers, work that prioritized social impact over financial returns. "I'm proud of you," Dad said quietly when I finished. I should have said that years ago, but I was too caught up in ... other things. That evening, the four of us had dinner together for the first time since before Stephanie's engagement. The conversation was careful but genuine, touching on our shared experiences. While acknowledging the distance that still existed between us, we were learning to be a family again, but on different terms based on mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchy. As I prepared to return to university the next day, "I know we can't undo the mistakes we made," she said, "but I want you to know that watching you succeed despite everything we put you through has taught me more about real strength than anything else in my life." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your sister told me about her volunteer work, about the families she's helping. She said you inspired her to think about what it means to actually contribute to the world. That's a gift you gave her, even after everything she did to hurt you." I hugged her then, a real embrace that acknowledged both the pain of our past and the possibility of our future. We would never be the close-knit family I'd once imagined, but we might be something better people who chose to love each other, despite our flaws rather than because we ignored them. As I drove back to campus that afternoon, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that night I'd decided to document my parents' choices. I'd set out to expose their hypocrisy, but I'd ended up liberating all of us from the toxic dynamics that had been destroying our family for years. The truth, I'd learned, wasn't just a weapon, it was also a foundation. And I was building something meaningful on that foundation, brick by careful brick. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hits the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.